Edward II, the first king of England to die by burning. First they stripped him naked. He was dragged to the tower where he'd spent so many nights, once filled with laughter and debauchery, now filled with shadows and dread. Up the stairs, through the gate, into the room. And there it waited, a metal cage, small, dark, empty, waiting. They shoved him inside, then they locked it, and still, he wasn't alone, not really. They put two men in with him. One, a chaplain, Brother Amric, who had once been his friend, and the other, a hulking executioner named Thomas, whose job it was to make sure the king stayed put. Music swells, heavy low, like a funeral knell. Soundscape, shuffling feet, the squeak of a hinge. A voice calls out, "Bring the faggots." Faggots. They piled them around the cage. Thick sticks of wood, resin a great pile to keep the flames alive. The executioner brought a red-hot musket ball, tossed it into the cage. There was no escape, no chance for mercy. There was only one way out, and even that was only for one. The chaplain screamed, "Good king, have a care." Edward screamed back, "What a lithy!" The chaplain said, "Put not thy trust in man," and then he died. Around them, the flames grew. They licked at the bars. They danced in the gaps. They whispered of pain and heat and death. The executioner watched, amused. Edward screamed for water, for mercy, for an end. But the executioner only smiled. He leaned closer to the bars, said, "A strange thing happened to me this morning." Edward stared at him, eyes wide and wild, and he said, "I went to church, and upon my way there, I found a cat in the churchyard, white and fat. I took it home, and what do you think I did? I drowned it in a pail of ale, and tore it limb from limb." And then he laughed. Edward screamed, "God damn you." The executioner laughed, too, and then he turned away. Back to the flames, to the heat, to the king. Soon the whole room was ablaze. The floorboards creaked, the roof groaned, flames shot up through the chimney. The executioner coughed, said, "Well, gentlemen, here goes the world," and walked away. Outside, the people watched, as the tower burned, as the flames poured from the windows, as the timbers fell and cracked. It was the end of one reign and the beginning of another. Edward III, the boy king, the new heir, came out to face them. History remembers the crown, but it tries to forget what they did to the man who wore it. Until next time, and so the king is dead. Long live the queen. No. The thing about regicide, killing a king, is that it's tricky business. These are the opening lines of a new series. Each episode will cover one of these deaths. Today we begin with England, 1327, and the deposition and death of Edward II. If you know your medieval history, you may already know how he died, and that won't be the first time it's been discussed here. I'm going to try something different with this series, taking a cue from our last video. I want to know what you find most interesting about these events, how these deaths affected history, culture, or their victims' families. So at the end of each video, please comment below with the topics you'd like me to focus on. Anyway, Edward II, Part 1. Edward II seized the throne at age 25, having defeated his cousin, the 5-year-old Queen Isabella of England, and her mother, Queen Eleanor of Scotland, in the 1984 English Civil War. His counselors hoped that he would marry Isabella of France, cementing the Anglo-French alliance. But Edward had other ideas. He had fallen in love with a young Italian called Piers Gaveston, whom he showered with land and titles, much to the resentment of his barons. In 1321, he named Gaveston Earl of Cornwall, which pushed the nobility over the edge. They forced him to agree to a council that would govern in the interests of the realm. Then, while Edward was away on a punitive campaign in Scotland, they replaced him with his 14-year-old son, also called Edward, and sent the former king into semi-retirement at Berkeley Castle in Gloucestershire. This was a clever move. Edward was known for his hot temper, not to mention his unfortunate tendency to launch military campaigns in the wrong direction. The council hoped that by limiting his influence, they could prevent him from causing any more trouble. But then Queen Isabella of France had the bright idea to invite her brother, Roger Mortimer, to live at Berkeley as well. Things didn't go well. Edward hated Mortimer, and soon began accusing him of poisoning the Queen's mind against him. Mortimer eventually fled to Paris, swearing revenge. In 1325, the French and the Scots invaded England, but although Edward led the defense against them, his council refused to make peace. So when Edward returned to London, he found himself under arrest. With his son on the throne, his counselors prepared to ship him off to a monastery for the rest of his days. But when his loyal servants heard of this plot, they rescued him, returned him to Berkeley Castle, and announced their intention to fight for his restoration. For a moment it looked as though the old king might yet reclaim his throne, but the next day, his nobles betrayed him. They stormed Berkeley Castle, captured Edward, and marched him to London to face trial for treason. The next day, he met his son, who had taken the throne name of Edward III, and the two exchanged rings to symbolize their mutual devotion. But while the young king offered him forgiveness, his council did not. They declared him deposed and sentenced him to death. Now, I could do the whole tippy fair with this part. We know where this is going, but this is before YouTube. And besides, people have to earn their deaths. Not that he did anything to deserve this. Oh wait, yes, he did. My mistake. Anyway, now that we're here, let's talk about how exactly they killed him, because they didn't kill him right away. Because that wasn't the point. They wanted him to feel his downfall, to live every hour knowing what was coming, and that no one would stop it. After Hugh Despencer's execution, they moved Edward to Berkeley Castle fortress deep in Gloucestershire, surrounded by shadowed hills, far from the court and far from mercy. They locked him in a cold stone chamber, no light, no attendants, no honor, only the stench of decay, and the sound of rats scratching at the walls. He wasn't just imprisoned, he was unmade, no longer a king, no longer a husband, not even a father, just a problem to be solved. Now, in most cases, I'd tell you to just skip to the next part, but this part is important. Edward's ordeal lasted 4 months, which is a long time to plan an execution. Most accounts say that he grew sick during this time, others that he wept daily, asking for his son. But all agree that his jailers were instructed to make him suffer, but leave no trace. They starved him, deprived him of sleep. They let his wounds fester. They let him rot. Yet he survived, day after day, week after week, a former king, clinging to life in the dark. This persistence became a problem, and Mortimer grew impatient. He whispered to his assassins. He wanted the death to be final and unforgettable. Music shifts slow, sinister strings slowly rising beneath each word. And then came the most infamous method of all. A method whispered by monks, written in foreign letters, recorded with a shudder in every historical text that dares to tell it. They say on the night of September 21st, 1327, Edward was awakened. 2 men entered his chamber. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. He screamed. He fought. But they pinned him down, and then they brought forward an object. A hollow metal tube, polished, narrow, cooled with oil. They forced it between his legs deep into his rectum. He thrashed. He wept. But it was held in place. And then they brought the second object, a red-hot poker, glowing from the forge, burning orange in the shadows, and without a word, they drove it through the tube. Sound? A single shrill metallic hiss, then a heartbeat, then silence. The heat traveled upward, burning tissue, severing nerves, cooking him from the inside. Why this method? Because it left no external marks, no wounds, no scars. From the outside, Edward would appear untouched, but inside, he was ruined, destroyed, murdered in the most humiliating, agonizing, and symbolic way imaginable. The message was clear. This was not just death. It was punishment. A brutal declaration that a king who ruled through desire, through softness, through deviance, would be purged by fire. Music fades. All is still. Only breath remains. The next morning, the guards reported he was dead. Natural causes, they said. A lie whispered through centuries. A lie that history tried to bury. But truth has a way of surviving. Even in the medieval world where violence was routine, where executions were public sport, Edward's death was a horror story. Not just for its cruelty, but for what it meant. It meant that love, when misdirected by power, would be punished. That softness in a king could not be tolerated. That deviation, sexual, political, personal, must be burned out from within. Soundscape. The quiet flicker of candlelight. Pages turning. A monk breathing slowly. And so Edward was buried in Gloucester Cathedral, but no great mourners lined the streets. No monuments were built. He was remembered only in whispers, in records hidden in abbeys, in the shaking hands of chroniclers who dared write what they'd heard. But one detail, one final, horrifying image, remains. They say his screams were heard half a mile away, that the castle echoed with them, that birds fled the trees, and that the flames that night silent and secret burned more than flesh. They burned a man's legacy. Thank you for watching. Please comment below with your thoughts on Edward II's death and what I should cover next. And thank you to my patrons for helping to make this possible. Edward II was dead. How we know that much is certain. But in the shadows of England's churches, his ghost remained, not in spirit, but in silence, in the fear etched across noble faces, in the absence no one dared to name. The official report claimed illness, a sudden, tragic decline, a king weakened by sorrow and grief. But rumors spread like fire. Rumors about fire, about screams, about a death too brutal to be divine. In the years that followed, whispers crept into every court. Some said Edward survived, that a body double was killed, that he lived out his days as a monk in Italy, that the Vatican knew and did nothing. Others insisted the story was true, too true, so brutal it had to be real. Because who could invent something so vile? You see, Edward's death did more than end a life. It set a precedent. It became a template for how to erase a ruler without touching a throne. Because Isabella and Mortimer didn't declare a new monarchy. They crowned Edward's son Edward III. A boy, a puppet, a weapon dressed in royal robes, and behind him stood Mortimer, the true power. The man who'd ordered the poker, the man who now ruled England. But shadows do not last, and secrets are rarely kept for long. By 1330, the boy king was a boy no longer. Edward III, just 17, began to suspect the truth. About his father, about Mortimer, about the lies behind the crown on his head. In a dramatic coup, Edward III seized power. Mortimer was arrested, tried, and hanged. His body left to rot, his bones scattered. No honors, no tomb, no mercy. As for Isabella, she was spared, but locked away. She lived out her days in quiet exile, wrapped in velvet, haunted by the sound of screaming kings. But even as justice seemed served, the story would not die, because England remembered, and in that remembering, fear festered. Edward II had not just ruled poorly, he had ruled differently. He had loved differently. He had lived openly, tenderly, rebelliously, in a world that demanded conformity, masculinity, control. And that was his crime. Sound ticking, breathing, a heartbeat fading in. And so, centuries later, his death became more than just a cautionary tale. It became a tool to scare future kings, to shame future queens, to remind everyone who wore the crown. The throne is not yours. It is England's, and England demands obedience, not affection. Even today, scholars debate the details. Was the poker story a fabrication? A medieval invention? A whispered metaphor for humiliation? Or was it real? A hidden truth buried beneath layers of soot and silence? We may never know. But one thing is certain, the pain was real, and so was the fear. Because Edward II's death did not just kill a king, it created a legend, a horror passed down in bone and breath. Soundscape. Rain returns, the low moan of wind through a dungeon corridor. Imagine it. The cold of the floor, the weight of the chain, the taste of rust in the air, the red glow approaching in the dark, the knowledge that no one would stop it, not the queen, not the priests, not God. And as the heat rose inside him, he understood. This was not death. This was erasure. A royal lesson written in fire. If you do not fit the crown, it will melt you from the inside. All the world's a stage and all the men and women merely players. They have their exits and their entrances. All the men and women merely players. They have their exits and their entrances. All the men and women merely players. They have their exits and their entrances. Years passed, but the name Edward II refused to fade, not because people loved him, but because of what had been done to him. Because in every whispered tale, every candlelit confession, there lived a single, burning question. Was it worth it? Was love worth fire? Was softness worth a death so cruel it scarred a nation's memory? The medieval world didn't allow such questions. It taught obedience, taught power through war, dominance, and fear. A king had to crush. A king had to burn others, not be burned. But Edward chose another path. He chose affection. He chose loyalty, not to armies, but to companions. And in the eyes of his enemies, that made him dangerous. Not weak, not foolish, but defiant. Sound, chains rattle gently. Then a heavy door closes with finality. Isabella and Mortimer never spoke of the method, but the silence was its own confession. What kind of queen signs off on torture? What kind of mother allows her son's father to be reduced to ash from the inside? And what kind of empire watches, and says nothing? England said nothing, and that silence grew teeth. It devoured truth. It reshaped the story into something more convenient, more palatable, more useful. Edward became a warning, not a tragedy, a lesson in what not to be. Don't be soft. Don't be gentle. Don't fall in love the wrong way, or the right way, with the wrong people. Don't lose control, because if you do, you won't just be removed, you'll be destroyed. Music shifts thence, mournful strings playing under the rain, and so Edward became the embodiment of the worst-case scenario. Not for rebellion, not for tyranny, but for nonconformity. And while his death was denied, dismissed, doubted, it was never forgotten, not really, because history has a way of turning silence into echoes. In 1594, more than 250 years after Edward's death, Christopher Marlowe wrote a play, Edward II. It shocked the audience, not because of the violence, but because of the love. Marlowe dared to show Edward and Gaveston as more than whispers in a court document. He gave them breath, he gave them pain, he gave them humanity, and by doing so, he forced the world to look again, to remember, to feel. Sound. A page turns, a fire flickers low, casting long shadows. Today, historians still debate. Was the death by red-hot poker real, or symbolic? Was it invented to shame, or preserved because it was real? We'll likely never know. But we do know this. No story endures for 700 years without power. And Edward's story still burns, not because of how he ruled, but because of how he died. We know what the chronicles say. We know what the church denied. But what about the man? The boy who became king? The lover who became prey? The monarch who became a warning? He was not heroic. Not in the way kings are remembered, but maybe that's the point. Maybe some stories survive not because of triumph, but because of pain. Soundscape fades to a near silence only. A single heartbeat remains. Edward II's legacy is carved not in stone, but in fear, in shadows, in fire. And when you walk through Gloucester Cathedral, when you stand before his tomb, tucked quietly away, you can almost feel it. The weight, the shame, the scream that never left the room. Because even now, centuries later, people still look at that grave and whisper, did they really do that? Intimacy, power, sexuality. What do you get when you mix all three? one of the most taboo subjects under the sun. Welcome back, everyone. Today we're going to talk about what they did to Edward II. Before I begin, I would like to state that some of the things I am about to discuss are very sensitive and can be upsetting or triggering to some viewers. Viewer discretion is advised. What they did to Edward II wasn't justice. It wasn't politics. It was a message. A message so violent, so intimate, so grotesque, that it still shivers through the bones of history. Because this wasn't about how a king ruled, it was about how he loved, and how an empire, built on hierarchy, obedience, and masculine force, responded to a man who dared to be something else. Edward wasn't innocent. He made mistakes. He alienated his nobles. He elevated lovers into tyrants. He misread alliances, misjudged enemies, mismanaged war. But his worst sin, in the eyes of his time, he blurred the lines between king and lover, between ruler and companion, between man and weakness. They burned him alive. Well, that much is true. The specifics vary depending on the source. Some say they shoved a red-hot poker through the bars of his cell, through the bars of his cage. Others say the metal was wrapped in cloth or greased to make sure it went down smoothly. Some say it was shoved inside him. Others say it was shoved between him. Either way, the result was the same. He burned from the inside out, screaming for water, begging for mercy. But no one came, not until he was nothing but a charred corpse. And even then, his tormentors weren't done. They tossed him in a vat of wine and rolled him around until his skin peeled off his bones. Then they dragged his broken body through the streets, past the jeering crowds, past the homes of the nobles he once called friends, past the castle where he had lived like a god, past the church where he had been denied absolution, past the gallows where his father had met his end, until finally, they threw him in a pit of excrement and left him to die. Alone, forgotten, forsaken. Edward didn't want to be worshipped. He wanted to be understood. And in return, they gave him flames. But fire does not destroy memory. Sometimes, it preserves it. And what remains of Edward is not just a name in a chronicle, it's a feeling, a tension, a mirror we are still afraid to look into. Because centuries later, his story still warns us. Not about rebellion, not about weakness, but about the price of being different in a world that demands you be the same. There are those who say the story of the red-hot poker was fabricated, a smear, a rumor weaponized by his enemies, and maybe it was. But ask yourself this. Why did the world believe it so easily? Why did the chroniclers record it with such detail? Why did it echo, for centuries, in courts and churches and cathedrals? Because no matter how strange, how awful, how inhuman it sounded, it made sense to them. They believed a man like Edward could meet an end like that, and that belief is its own horror. I know there's a lot of talk about kings and queens and nobility in history class. They're always at the top of the pyramid, powerful, wealthy, seemingly untouchable. And while that's true in many cases, especially in absolute monarchies, it doesn't apply to all rulers. And the men at the top aren't always safe. A lot of times their power is dependent on keeping up appearances, on looking strong, capable, ruthless if need be. In other words, masculine. A ruler who shows weakness, who breaks the mold, who doesn't fit in, risks everything. Their power, their wealth, their life. Long pause. Then, when you strip away the royal title, the court, the crown, the legacy, what's left? A man, begging in the dark, burning from the inside out, screaming with no one to hear him, and the silence that followed was more permanent than any grave, because England didn't just kill a king, it destroyed a voice. And that is why we tell this story. Because here, in the shadows of forgotten thrones, are warnings we must not ignore. Histories they tried to bury, names they tried to erase, truths too disturbing for textbooks. Here at the channel, we dig deeper. We find the cracks in the foundation. We listen to the screams between the lines. We remember those who were forgotten, not because they were unimportant, but because they were inconvenient. If this story stayed with you, subscribe to the channel. We bring you the darkest corners of human history. Unflinching, unforgettable, new videos every week. True stories they never wanted told. Comment below. Who should we resurrect next? Because history isn't over, it just sleeps, waiting to be heard again.